just leave. The red flags were going up for sure.
When I got to that intersection, my heart sank. Daniel's tracks didn't make a left towards home. They made a right-hand turn out in the desert.
His family is desperate for answers.
I just knew my son was in trouble. If he's out there riding around in that heat out there in that desert, that's very dangerous.
I know the desert is just a place where bad things happen.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Daniel's last known steps.
The Buckeye Police Department called and told me, hey, look, we didn't find Daniel, we just have his vehicle.
The car been wrecked. In my mind, I'm thinking, what if he's hurt? I was at a total stage of panic, scared beyond anything I ever felt in my life. I just want my son back.
The more people who know Daniel's story, the greater the chance of bringing...
Father Daniel Cornelius Robinson, who went missing on June the 23rd of 2021. Daniel graduated from the College of Charleston, South Carolina. He came out to Phoenix, Arizona, where he landed his job with Matrix New World as a field geologist. So he really enjoyed being here in Arizona because he get to span his horizons. He's a special child. When my son was born, he was missing his right hand. The way he grew up, his mentality, he taught himself how to play the trumpet. Some people thought that was impossible. He did the French horn. He even though did a little bit of the trombone. He played a little bit of football, doing sports like that, basketball. Everything he tried to accomplish, he did that.
He was used to people saying, why were you born like that? And he'll just say, that's the way God made me. That's what makes him so special. He would not let anyone tell him what he couldn't do with his prosthesis. He wore it until high school. When he got to college, he says, I'm done with it. This is me. I love me. And whoever doesn't like what they see, oh well. And he just loved his friends. But he really wasn't dating. He said, there's nobody like my mom. I was like, okay. What compelled Daniel to become a geologist is climate change, and he wanted to make a difference. In Arizona, they have to drill for water sources because it's so dry and, hot out there. He tests the soil to see if the water would be drinkable, if it have parasites. And he'd been working in remote deserts. And sometimes I was wondering if he didn't go to Arizona, would he be missing?
My name is Ken Elliott. I'm a pump technician for Weber Water Resources. On the morning of June 23rd, we arrived at the job site at 9:30, and I walked over to Daniel's Jeep to introduce myself. We spoke about a few technical aspects of the job and where we were at on the development phase of this well. It was raining fairly hard at that point. I had asked him whether or not he wanted to just hang tight and let this storm cell pass overhead before we started so we wouldn't get all of our paperwork wet. This is where things started to become odd. When I looked up, Daniel was staring off into the desert. He had a very, very distant look in his eyes. That's when he got in his Jeep and left. Must have been around 2:30. The principal of the firm called me. They had not heard from Daniel yet. I hopped in my work truck. The only tracks were Daniel's because the storms had washed all the dirt roads clear. When I got to that intersection, my heart sank because Daniel's tracks didn't make a left and head east towards home. They made a right-hand turn and headed west out in the desert. And I thought, he's so far out in front of me. He could be anywhere.
My sister Davisha gives me a call, like, hey, Daniel's missing. One of his friends from work came over to my apartment and let me know that they couldn't find him. Daniel's never been the person to give up or to quit anything or to just walk away. So for him to go to work for a few hours and then just leave out of nowhere, didn't say anything to anybody, the red flags were going up for sure.
I'm freaking out. And that's why I'm gonna call his phone. I called it, he didn't answer. Called it again, he didn't answer. And the next time I left a message to Dane, this is Mom, you know how I am. I'm worried now. I'm worried about you. I need you to pick up this phone. He didn't pick up the phone. I text him. I have the text. I say, hey, son, where are you? You need to answer your phone.
I remember exactly what I was doing on June the 23rd, 2021. I'm retired military. I was sitting on my back porch in Columbia, South Carolina, when I received that phone call from his sister telling me that it was well over 6 hours that he was missing from that job. That was problematic for me because I know Daniel, he would not go that long without saying anything to his siblings or his mother or myself. You know, he'll let us know something. We called Dane's phone, his ring, and finally go to the voicemail until I guess it finally died, and it goes straight to the voicemail. We didn't hear from him that whole entire day. That's when I knew something was wrong, and I decided to report him missing. I called the Buckeye Police Department. I talked to Officer Cruz. One of the biggest things that I was really happy about is that he decided to take a drive down this road called Sun Valley Parkway. He told me he was out there to look and see if maybe he's stranded on the side of the road somewhere. Of course, they told me quickly they didn't find my son. You know, you find out your child is missing. Of course, I'm not going to sleep. On June 24th, I grabbed everything I can, threw it in my vehicle, and started heading out west to Arizona. Guessing over 20-some hours. It was the hardest drive. It seemed like I couldn't get here fast enough. One thing I learned out of the military is never leave a fallen comrade behind. One of the first things I did when I decided to hit that road to head to Arizona to find my son was to make my son a mission. Of course, your child is missing. It can put you in an emotional state. In the military, we learn how to put those emotions at bay. He is my mission. The first thing I did is went up to the Buckeye Police Department, got more information about where he was last seen. I found out it was in the desert itself.
I'm Nicole Griggin. I'm a reporter with ABC 15 here in Phoenix. I don't think people realize that here in Arizona, we're actually one of the top 5 states for missing persons. There's just so much desert that getting lost or being stranded in the desert, you're out there on your own. So it doesn't take long for dehydration to set in, your skin burning. The elements out there are really severe and unsurvivable, really.
The desert environment in the summer is very, very harsh. It can get up to 110, 115 degrees. So you clearly have to be prepared, food, water, plenty of provisions. And the wildlife that you need to watch out for are rattlesnakes. They're territorial, they have dens. When they come out, they're cold-blooded, so they'll typically be coiled up on a rock or somewhere in the sun to warm up. And they blend in with their native surroundings. You may not even see one until you're almost on top of it.
You're not up against just the heat, the sun, the elements, but people do go out to the deserts to recreate, shoot off guns. We're talking rifles, assault rifles. There's the risk of cartels, drugs crossing, people smuggling people across the border.
I know the desert is just a place where bad things happen. I mean, I have watched many shows, of course, to know that, you know, that's not like a hangout area. So I was worried that maybe he ran into foul play.
On June 25th, Daniel had been missing for 2 days at this point. Buckeye police did their first aerial search by helicopter looking for him. They searched this area all around his work site, and they weren't able to find any trace of him. So Buckeye police were putting up flyers in the desert and at the local airport in case people passing through may have seen him get on a plane.
When someone is missing, it's very crucial to search immediately. You shouldn't have to wait. That make it slimmer. Statistic-wise, less likely you'll recover that person.
If someone does die out in the desert, bodies can decompose out there and be left to bones and fragments pretty quickly. Here in Maricopa County, the ME's office has pages of unidentified people that were in the desert, and they're still left unidentified for years.
With my time in Afghanistan, dealing with desert, I just knew my son was in trouble. If he's out there riding around in that heat out there in that desert, that's very dangerous. I wonder if he had water and things like that. So those kind of things went across my mind. The first thing I want to do is get out there to that well site. That was the last spot that my son was supposed to have been seen at. But Buckeye Police Department told me not to go into the desert, so I would take my binoculars close to the area where the well site would be at. My heart was racing, of course, and I tried to imagine myself as being my son, where he was staring off to. And I just need to understand what he was feeling, what he was thinking at the moment.
So while my father was there in Arizona, my other sister in California and the sister in Arizona, we were on social media trying to figure out what's been happening before Daniel went missing. He deleted all of his images off of Instagram, so I'm thinking, does it mean anything? And it's just, at least for me, it was very upsetting that the police department, no one took us seriously enough to say, something's not right, he is missing. We know it may look like he just walked away, but something's not right with this.
A day or so prior to him going missing, Daniel called me and he left me a voicemail. And that's the last message that I have for Daniel.
If you're free, you could call me back if you want, but in other words, I just want to let you know regardless, I love you. And yeah, we could talk later. All right, bye.
I didn't think about it at the time, but I didn't like what I heard. I didn't like him saying, well, Mama, no matter what, I love you. I heard it in his voice. His voice didn't sound right. And I beat myself up about why didn't I answer that phone that night.
When I first heard that Daniel was missing, I was at work and I got a call from one of our mutual friends, a kid that had also graduated with us from college. I think it was only a day or so after Daniel was reported missing. It was just really weird to hear because I had just seen him a couple days ago. I had visited Daniel on Thursday, June 17th. That weekend when I was with him, everything seemed pretty normal as far as I was concerned. Daniel was kind of showing me around Phoenix. I had never really explored the city before, so he took me to a few of his favorite places. I hadn't seen him in at least a year. I remember he was super excited to be able to hang out together. I met Daniel in one of our geology classes together. We quickly became friends because we were both guys that like to goof around. Daniel was a very friendly, social guy, and the last time that I saw Daniel, he did mention to me that he had met this girl. He didn't go too into detail with anything about it, but I was excited for him because I had never known him to have a girlfriend or anything super serious going on.
He worked a second job where he met this young lady, and I think at that moment just was infatuated, on first sight and wanted to get to know her a little better, so they exchanged numbers at some point. They was texting back and forth for a little bit. I'll say just a few weeks. They did go on one date together, nothing very serious.
When he told me he was going out on a date with her, I was so happy for him because I knew it was just a while since he been out on a date. So he was quite excited. And I think it was just a love at first sight with him in the beginning with her. But I told him, you gotta remember, a woman likes to be pursued just for a little bit. Then if the feelings are not mutual, then it's time to back away from her.
So early on in the investigation, there was this woman who Daniel was seeing that Buckeye police were told to look into and see if she has any idea on where he might be. Police eventually track her down, and she says that she doesn't know where he is, that she hasn't seen him. But this woman does end up sharing with Buckeye police her last text exchanges with Daniel. what exactly does it mean that you'll never see me again? It kind of raised some concerns on what was his mental state at the time when he went missing.
Prior to him going missing, Daniel, he would say stuff like, you have to watch out for your self-being. Sometimes you have to be able to cut people off if they're hurting your feelings, and don't talk to them for a while, because you have to protect your mental being instead of having somebody always hurting your feelings.
Within the last month or so prior to him going missing, there's a big shift in his personality just because he's been so shut off and reserved. I didn't want to press him too hard to have him freeze up or to, shut away from answering anything. But we tried to gauge and see where he was mentally, like if he's doing okay.
I know my child was lonely. I know he wanted friends to talk to on a regular. He had no female companionship. All he had was his sister. And that's mainly was me and Daniel conversations prior to him leaving. It's just the frustration of life and COVID. You've been in the house for a whole year. And, all his friends are in Charleston and Colorado. He didn't have any friends there, and he wanted friends so bad, just people to hang out with, talk to.
It's been over a week, no signs of Daniel. Unfortunately, his family didn't have a key to get inside his apartment. Police weren't able to get a warrant because they needed a proof of crime. So they actually went to the landlord to get inside to do a wellness check at this time. His apartment was an indication of where his mind may have been at the time.
When I entered his apartment, I seen my son pain. I seen the stress. I seen the pain. I felt the sadness. I mean, dishes in the sink, dishes on the floor, clothes on the floor, disheveled bathroom, hairs on the floor, just chaos and misery.
I lived with him since he was born. Daniel's never been like an organized person, but this was beyond even him. Like, it was dirty, it was bad. Daniel's never been the kind of person to live like that. You can just see that he was clearly going through something, and he stopped caring about his living space.
I think Daniel just snapped. He said, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm trying to be productive at my job and my life, and every time I take 2 steps forward, I get pulled 5 steps back. I get off work and I work another job. Is it supposed to be this way? This is how life's supposed to be for me? He said, I'm tired for a moment. I need to breathe. I don't need to worry about this right now. But there's nothing in this world will make him ever dream of taking his life. I mean, Daniel never really bit his tongue on telling me anything. If he was feeling crazy or ooky about himself, I think he'll come to me and say, listen, Mom, I'm having some serious issues right now. I really need your help. I really do believe that he would tell me he's having some real serious issues.
I guess as his older sibling, I've always worried about my siblings, but I don't think he would have harmed himself. He was forward-thinking. The days before he went missing, he was suggesting that he was going to find another job at some point, or he's going to move. He had plans to do something else, so I don't think he would have harmed himself.
I last spoke to my son 2 days prior to him going missing. Him and his sister had plans to go hiking that weekend. We talked about my plans to come up there in July to visit him.
Knowing Daniel, I don't think he's the type of person that would want to run away from anything. He had a lot of good friends and a good family, so I think that he had a pretty good life.
I was in so much pain, and I didn't know how much more I can take without knowing where my son is. The pain and the stress of seeing Daniel in my dreams calling my name. I said, God, you gotta give me something. Then we received a tip, and I was excited. I'm going to find my son.
Around that time of July 7th, I did get information from the Buckeye Police Department telling me there was a report of somebody calling in and saying they saw someone that fit the description of my son Daniel, but somebody who was also missing a limb.
A woman, I believe from Phoenix, Arizona, spotted someone who appeared to be my brother at a grocery store. Just something about him drew her to him. She went over to speak to the kid. He doesn't look like he's homeless. And she said that the kid said, "Oh, I'm just on a journey right now, something I have to do." And she offered him granola bar, some water, told him to be safe. She wanted to take a picture, like if someone was looking for him, but then the person declined, no pictures of me, please.
It was the detectives from Buckeye Police Department who was able to go there and check that out. But according to them, that wasn't Daniel.
So it disappointed me tremendously. I just want my son back.
At this point, it's 2 weeks in, no signs of Daniel. Buckeye Police reached out to the Civil Air Patrol. It's a nonprofit with the U.S. Air Force to assist and do another aerial search for him.
They showed up around 8 o'clock that morning. There's gonna be a few flyovers over the area where my son was last seen. I was present. They just kind of zigzagged until they made their way up north. Did a search for, I'd say roughly, they got finished roughly around 11 o'clock that morning. The next day gave me a map of the area that they searched. They didn't come up with anything, they came up empty.
Daniel's father, David, at this point, he had nothing to go on. So David created his own website, pleasehelpfinddanielrobinson.com, hoping he would start to get information on what happened to his son.
This is David Robinson. I'm the father of geologist Daniel Cornelius Robinson, who went missing in the desert of Buckeye, Arizona. Coming out for this live to tell you all I have a tip line that I'm paying for. So please, I'm really desperate here trying to find my son. I'm really depending on you all to help.
It was really his effort on social media, pushing the public to send any information that was helping tips come in on who may have seen Daniel.
Anytime somebody have leads, I follow a lot of leads. I've been to Sedona, to Flagstaff, and a couple other places, but I came back with a negative result. It wasn't Daniel.
Buckeye Police is a smaller police department in comparison to the surrounding cities, and they have a lot of land to cover. So David posted on the website, he asked the community for help. He started to put together these community searches out in the desert.
I just wanted to come out live to tell you all that I am having a search tomorrow. You guys, if you can, please come along. All the information that you need will be on pleasehelpfinddaniel.com.
I was able to start my own searches that way. We put out the information about the search to the public, and people showed up.
I'm really grateful you coming out here from the bottom of my heart to search for my son, Daniel. The terrain is really huge and large. I can't do it by myself, so I'm really grateful for you all coming out.
We have a mapping system. We have those maps broken down to grids. Say, hey, today we're searching this grid.
I just couldn't imagine being in David's shoes, not knowing where Daniel's at. I can't imagine not having answers.
Keep on looking for Daniel because my heart tells me to, and for the family.
I always say that if I or any one of my family or loved ones ever went missing, I would want someone to do the same thing for me. I feel his pain, and I feel like I know Daniel through him.
I thank everybody for searching for Daniel. I really, really, really appreciate it that they took the time out of their busy schedules to help find my son.
Oh! They've got a bone there.
Couldn't move, I was really stunned. It was scary because then I realized my son went missing in an area where things was happening, obviously. So it makes it really bad for me and make it tough.
What we're looking at is top of the skull right here, and then a piece of vertebrae. Trying to identify to see what this is compared to the human anatomy, is an app that I've got that we can quickly identify to see if it matches anything. I'm going to go ahead and upload this. I'm going to shoot a message over to the medical examiner, and we'll have them evaluate it. But I'm pretty sure this is a small animal. Probably a coyote.
I was relieved. It was animal remains, but it's a roller coaster. When I go out to the desert search, for instance, Every day is like day one. You go out there in hopes to find my son alive out there and rescue him. Then it gets grimmer and grimmer as the months have been passing by.
David and these volunteers were out there first thing in the morning before the heat. And sadly, all these efforts, they still weren't finding any trace of Daniel. On July 19th, nearly a month since Daniel went missing, finally Buckeye police have a break in the case.
The Buckeye Police Department called me and told me, hey, look, Mr. Robinson, we found Daniel's vehicle in a 20-foot ravine in the remote area of the desert. You know, the first thing I'm thinking, the next sentence would be that they found my son.
Robinson was last seen June 23, 2021. If you have any information, please contact the Buckeye Police Tip Line at 623-349-6411.
The Buckeye Police Department called and told me, hey, look, we didn't find Daniel, we just have his vehicle. A rancher checking for his cattle out in a remote area of the desert ran into Daniel's Jeep Renegade in a 20-foot ravine.
The car been wrecked. In my mind, I'm thinking, what if he's hurt? I was at a total stage of panic, scared beyond anything I ever felt in my life.
The airbags were deployed. The sunroof was kicked out, but still no sign of Daniel here.
When he wasn't in the car, it's like a moment of relief, hope, and then dread at the same time. You could be taken out quickly in the desert.
I remember seeing this vehicle for the first time the way it was, and it was very devastating. The detective asked me, he said, Mr. Robinson, because we're standing at a distance, he said, you go over there and you can look inside the vehicle. I just couldn't move. I was really stunned.
Inside the car, all of Daniel's personal items, his backpack, his cell phone, his keys. And then on the outside of the car, his clothes were scattered all around like he threw them off. And then his wallet was found inside his jeans with all of his credit cards. Is he naked in the middle of the desert in this heat? And then we learned that in the trunk there were 2 cases of water.
You know, with his degree, he knows and understands, you know, the desert terrain a lot. You can only survive out there with extreme dry heat for very long without water. He wouldn't have left all the water, or at least if he got into the wreck, my thought is he would probably stay in the car where it's shaded and he has the water and it's more safe and contained.
Daniel's car was found 3 miles from the well site where he was last seen.
Assuming that Daniel crashed his Jeep so close to the job site, he could have very easily walked back to the job site in less than an hour.
And it just makes you wonder, wouldn't you have seen it if you were doing these ground searches, if you were doing these aerial searches, and all of a sudden, here it is in this ravine 3 miles away? I think there were a lot of concerns that how did this car get here? It had to have been placed here by someone. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere when we've been searching this area for so long.
It wasn't covered. There was, you know, there were no rocks on it. There were no debris on the car. You know, bluish Jeep out in the middle of a brownish red desert. Even with it being in a ravine, I just don't believe that they would have possibly have missed that from the air. So I think the car showed back up after the searches.
I had a theory that was given to me by someone at the Buckeye Police Department of what they think happened to my son. They felt like, you know, he escaped that rollover without injury because they didn't see any blood in the vehicle. He kicked the glass out of the sunroof and got out. But they also believe that he had a severe head injury. And once he got out of the vehicle, he shredded his clothes because the brain injury make you feel hot. And you feel hot and you shred your clothes. And he may have walked off and come to his injuries.
If he was in this accident, he was likely really hurt. and he was out of his mind, so to speak. And that's kind of the only explanation that we saw, that Daniel maybe didn't have any idea what had happened to him. Maybe that's why he left his keys. Maybe that's why he left the water. Maybe that's why he just started walking in the middle of the desert, but we don't know.
Like, maybe if you did get hot, you take your shirt off at least, but I don't think my brother would strip down naked and leave all of his clothes there. It was very upsetting because any person, whether mentally sound or not, can't walk through that for very long and get very far that you couldn't see them. There's no way my brother would have gotten within 3 miles of the site and not find any inkling that he was there. This doesn't add up.
One thing that bothered me the most, I had a severe head injury from IED blast. That's the reason why I'm retired from the military, and I never shredded my clothes off. So when they told me that, I couldn't understand the science behind that. So that made me want to get my own investigator, get a second opinion.
My name is Jeff McGrath. I am a criminal private investigator. I specialize in accident reconstruction. David Robinson reached out to me a couple of days after they found the vehicle. He felt there was something that wasn't right with the vehicle and with the investigation. The vehicle itself, as I started working my way around it, we noticed there was damage significantly to the right front side of the vehicle. That's probably what blew the airbags in the vehicle. It had to have struck something fairly large, and it had to be pretty solid to cause the damage I saw. Where the vehicle was laid, there was nothing around it that immediately that I could see that would have caused all the damage I was seeing on the vehicle. It didn't make sense, so it needed some further investigation. The police department had turned over the report of the airbag control module, as some people call it the black box of the vehicle. When I started to analyze the crash data report, the vehicle was doing anywhere from 29 to just over 30 miles an hour, consistently all the way through up to airbag deployment. And that, again, takes me back to the terrain. I took my vehicle out there and I tried the same thing. I couldn't get it above 15 miles an hour. It was absolutely just insane doing it. It was too rough. When you go out there and you stand out there, you can see its ridges and valleys, and it's just not possible. Then I got onto a all-terrain vehicle, and I attempted it with that as well. And that thing I got up just about 22 miles an hour. To imagine Daniel's vehicle traveling that long at that speed in the area where it was recovered, it doesn't make sense. It's not physically possible. The crash data report also indicated at the time of airbag deployment, the vehicle had then driven another 11 miles. So the 11 miles leads me to believe the vehicle was definitely moved after the initial airbag deployment. And there's no doubt in my mind of that.
Based on the evidence that the private investigator gave us, I just think that maybe Daniel wanted to get away for a moment and then abandoned his car somewhere in the Buckeye area. Someone or some people found his car and just took it. Once the news was released that Daniel's missing, this is his car, they might have dumped the car in attempts to just absolve themselves and not be caught up in an investigation. Because it doesn't make sense that a person could survive a car crash of that nature, rolling down a hill the way it rolled down. There was no forensic evidence of blood, nothing that would suggest that Daniel was in the car at the time of that wreckage. So it looks like it was staged there, like it was placed. Who did it, we don't know.
Remember, I'm on a mission to find out what happened to my son. So I expanded my searches out to cover the area where the vehicle was found.
Daniel's father, David, is determined to find his son. He's been here in Arizona leading search parties every Saturday since his son vanished, and those search parties are making a difference. On July 31st, a shocking discovery by one of his father's search teams, finding a human skull and shoulder. The team immediately alerted the Buckeye police.
I just hit the floor and I just couldn't hold myself together. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, a body, my child is gone.
I did receive a call from my dad. They did find the skull out there. And that was a pretty tough time.
We have CC Buckeye Police has taped off the scene, and at this point, medical examiners confirmed it. and we don't know whose it is.
I try to keep as much hope as I can. I try to keep my emotions at bay, so it makes it really bad for me and scary.
In my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, a body, my child is gone. I lost it. I lost it. I went into an uncontrollable cry, and it wouldn't stop. It wouldn't stop. I hit the floor. I mean, I woke up in the middle of the night crying and calling Daniel's name. I was calling people that I know from the church to pray with me.
Shortly after discovering this skull, it was determined that it wasn't Daniel. But the medical examiner's office thought they knew who this may have been. You know, it could be closure for another family.
You know, just to find their loved one that way. My heart broke for someone, but at least Daniel helped bring someone home. So that makes me proud.
Thank you guys for your prayers and support. Came negative for anything that's related to my son. So I'm grateful for that. So thank you guys for your help and your love.
I can't imagine how emotional it would be for the family to have to continue to do these searches, wanting to find Daniel. But at the same time, you don't want it to be finding him in the desert, because then you know that you have to lay him to rest.
Trying to get my spirits back up. It's kind of rough today. Like I say, my spirits are down mentally. Very hard today for me. Very depressing, you know. Been a long time searching for my son, but I'm still pushing it. Thank you guys for your support. God bless you. Thank you for everything you do and all your help. So keep me going.
The volunteers that's there, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, sisters, uncles, you name it. And you know, I say one thing about them, they're passionate. I mean, it's hot out there and they're really looking. That's the reason why we find human remains. They're really passionately looking. They really care. They show empathy and things like that and stick out there with me.
Mr. Robinson is so dependent on volunteers. And if I imagine it, that his son was like someone in my family, that's what got me coming out. I want to help and bring closure to him and his family.
I'm here for the long haul. There's about a handful of us that come here every Saturday, so I'm not gonna give up. As long as I'm here, you know.
I wanted to get involved any way that I could and join them for one of the searches. The search was pretty scary, just the thought of potentially finding my friend out there in the desert, but it was definitely warmed my heart to see how many people had shown up, these random strangers that had all gathered together for this kid that they had never even met.
You know, no matter what's going on in our lives, this is important. We've dedicated ourselves to this, and he needs the help. So we're there for him as long as it takes.
I had an auntie, and she said, David, when will there be a time to come to your head to say enough is enough? I did all I can and just move on. That was hard for me. That is still hard for me. I can't even get that in my brain. You know, it's not a time where I can actually say that to myself. I can't even envision a date when I'll say, yeah, I think I did enough, and enough is enough, and it's time for me to stop now.
In September, Daniel had been missing for 3 months now. At this time, Gabby Petito goes missing. And you start seeing these headlines on national outlets just asking for help in finding her. And you see Gabby Petito's face everywhere.
Missing for weeks. Now the family of a Northport woman who was last heard from in August while on a cross-country drive with a boyfriend wants answers.
You see the coverage of Gabby Petito, and then you had on social media people raising the concern that there are people of color missing across the country who aren't getting the same type of coverage. And I think that's what really brought to light Daniel's case. And Daniel's family was starting to get this national coverage that they had been seeking.
Right now, about 600,000 missing persons are in the U.S. Many of them are people of color whose cases have not gotten the same attention as those of young white women like Gabby Petito.
At that moment, I was so excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, like someone's actually, heard our stories. All of our hard work that's finally getting out there that, he's missing. Like maybe this can really help us get this going.
The attention paid to the Gabby Petito mystery is raising questions about others who disappear with little, if any, coverage. For instance, 24-year-old geologist Daniel Robinson vanished after work one day in Buckeye, Arizona. His father believes people of color who go missing are generally disregarded.
Every situation should be handled the same way. I think first 24 or 48 hours is crucial to finding someone.
We shouldn't have to depend on other stories or other cases to push our own story. And we just want answers just like anyone else. I think, or my brother or everyone else's brother or father, siblings, whoever they may be, they deserve the same attention.
Again, and Daniel is a very special person. We hope that some more eyeballs on this case might get some more answers for you as you continue your search for him.
It was kind of that really sad feeling knowing that everyone is seeing this and there's still no indication on what happened to him.
What I would say for the people at home, to keep sending your prayers and your thoughts to our family. This kind of thing is very difficult, very hard to go through. This is something that you see on TV.
August 12, 2021, began like countless other summer days in Plymouth. The sky over Devon carried the pale blue glow of late afternoon, while a gentle sea breeze drifted inland from Plymouth Sound. Children rode bicycles through quiet residential streets. Neighbors paused outside their front gardens to exchange familiar smiles before retreating indoors for dinner. Cars rolled slowly along narrow roads lined with brick houses that had witnessed decades of ordinary family life. Nothing in Keyham suggested that history was only minutes away from carving a permanent scar across the neighborhood. People would later remember tiny details that had seemed meaningless at the time. A woman hanging freshly washed clothes in her back garden. A delivery van disappearing around the corner. The laughter of children echoing between rows of terraced homes. A dog pulling gently against its lead, impatient for an evening walk. Moments that, in retrospect, became frozen in time because they happened just before everything changed. There is something uniquely terrifying about violence arriving in a place where people have long believed they are safe. Not in the center of a city. Not inside a bank. Not during a robbery. But outside someone's own front door. Keyham was never supposed to become synonymous with horror. It was the kind of community where generations often lived within walking distance of one another. Many residents had known each other for years. Children grew up recognizing familiar faces. Elderly neighbors watched over nearby homes almost instinctively. It was far from perfect, but it possessed something increasingly rare, a sense of quiet familiarity. That evening, nothing hinted that the neighborhood was about to become the scene of Britain's deadliest mass shooting in more than a decade. The first emergency calls would describe confusion rather than certainty. Some callers believed fireworks had exploded. Others thought a car backfired. Several simply couldn't understand what they had seen. Because in Britain, unlike in many other countries, the sound of gunfire is so uncommon that people often search for almost any other explanation first. Reality arrived only after the silence between each blast. One shot. Then another. Then another. The ordinary sounds of a summer evening were replaced by screams. Doors slammed shut. Curtains moved. Phones appeared in shaking hands. Within minutes, the peaceful rhythm of everyday life collapsed into chaos. Before investigators collected evidence. Before detectives reconstructed timelines. Before politicians debated firearm licensing. 5 innocent people had already lost their lives. A mother. A father. A 3-year-old daughter. A man walking his dog. A grandmother standing outside a hair salon. Their stories had nothing in common. Their lives followed different paths. They woke that morning with different plans, different worries, different dreams. Yet destiny placed each of them within the path of one young man carrying a legally owned shotgun. His name was Jake Davison. He was 22 years old. He did not arrive in Keyham from somewhere else. He did not travel across the country searching for victims. He lived there. Those streets were his streets. The houses were familiar. The faces around him belonged to people who had unknowingly shared the same neighborhood for years. That fact would haunt investigators almost as much as the killings themselves. Because evil had not crossed the city boundaries. It had quietly grown inside them. Long before the shooting, Jake Davison had become increasingly isolated. He spoke openly online about failure, about loneliness, about anger, about feeling left behind by a world that seemed to reward everyone except him. His videos revealed a young man searching desperately for explanations while sinking deeper into hopelessness. Some days he blamed society. Other days he blamed women. Sometimes he blamed himself. The line separating resentment from despair had gradually become impossible to distinguish. To strangers watching those recordings months later, the warning signs appeared painfully obvious. But warning signs rarely seem obvious before tragedy. At the time, they were simply another collection of videos among millions uploaded to the internet. Another frustrated young man speaking to an invisible audience. Another face easily forgotten. Yet behind the camera, something darker was slowly taking shape. Not overnight. Not within a single argument. Not because of one disappointment. The road toward August 12th was built piece by piece, thought by thought, frustration by frustration. No single moment could fully explain what happened. No single event transformed Jake Davison into a killer. Instead, investigators would later uncover a complicated picture of declining mental health, growing social isolation, personal grievances, violent behavior, and repeated opportunities where intervention might have changed the future. Those opportunities now existed only in hindsight. The victims never had the luxury of hindsight. For them, August 12th unfolded exactly like every ordinary Thursday before it. Maxine Davison spent the day unaware that it would be her last. Lee Martin never imagined that an evening walk with his young daughter would become the final memory witnesses carried forever. Little Sophie Martin had only begun discovering the world around her. She could not possibly understand danger. Stephen Washington simply wanted to walk his dog through familiar streets. Kate Shepard stood outside a local salon without the slightest reason to believe that death was approaching from around the corner. There was no connection linking these 5 lives together. Until 6 minutes erased the future they had all expected to have. Mass shootings often leave behind numbers. 5 dead. 2 injured. 6 minutes. 1 gunman. Statistics appear neat. Orderly. Easy to print across newspaper headlines. But numbers never capture what violence actually steals. A little girl's future birthdays. A mother's conversations that would never happen. Family photographs that would never be taken. Christmas dinners with 1 empty chair. Phone numbers that would remain stored forever, even though nobody would ever answer again. Every victim carried an entire universe inside their ordinary lives. Every family would later describe simple routines they desperately wished they could relive one last time. The tragedy of Plymouth was measured not only by the lives lost, but by the futures erased in an instant. As investigators pieced together those 6 terrible minutes, another question began demanding attention. How had this happened? Not simply why. Why is a question that often has no satisfying answer. But how? How did a troubled 22-year-old man, known to authorities because of previous violent behavior, regain possession of a shotgun? How did warning signs fail to become intervention? How did despair evolve into mass murder? Those questions would echo through police investigations, public inquiries, parliamentary discussions, and grieving households alike. The answers would expose uncomfortable truths. Not about a single individual alone, but about systems designed to recognize danger before lives are lost. Yet none of those answers could change what had already happened. Because while investigators would spend months reconstructing every movement Jake Davison made that evening, the victims experienced those moments only once. There would be no second chance. No alternate ending. Only the unbearable reality that one peaceful neighborhood had become part of British criminal history forever. In the days that followed, flowers began appearing along the streets of Keyham. Handwritten messages accumulated beside photographs. Children drew pictures they barely understood. Strangers traveled from across the country simply to stand in silence. Residents looked at familiar roads as though seeing them for the first time. Places that had once represented home now carried memories impossible to escape. Some people would later admit they could no longer walk certain streets without remembering where each victim had fallen. Others said the neighborhood never truly became quiet again. Not because of noise, but because memory has its own kind of echo. Years later, visitors driving through Keyham would see ordinary houses, ordinary sidewalks, ordinary gardens. Nothing immediately announces that unimaginable violence unfolded there. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. Places do not always look different after tragedy. People do. Families do. Communities do. And on one warm August evening in 2021, an ordinary corner of Plymouth learned just how fragile ordinary life can be. For investigators, every tragedy begins with a timeline. For the families, it begins with a memory. Some remembered the last goodbye before work. Others remembered a hurried wave from across the street, a promise to be home in time for dinner, or a child asking for one more minute outside before bedtime. None of those moments felt important when they happened. They were the kinds of moments people experience every day without stopping to think that they could become the final chapter of a life. Later, those memories would be replayed over and over, polished by grief until every expression, every word, every glance seemed to carry a meaning no one could have recognized in the moment. The hardest truth about ordinary life is that it never announces when it is about to end. At approximately 6 o'clock that evening, the streets of Keyham still belonged to everyday routines. A few residents watered flowers that had survived another warm summer day. Curtains remained open as televisions flickered inside family living rooms. The smell of evening meals drifted through open kitchen windows. Somewhere nearby, children argued over games that would be forgotten before nightfall. It was a neighborhood preparing to settle into another quiet evening. Only one house carried a different atmosphere. Behind a familiar front door on Biddick Drive, frustration had been building long before the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Jake Davison's life had become increasingly defined by isolation. He was not someone who had achieved the future he imagined for himself. Friends had gradually disappeared from his daily life. Stable employment remained difficult to maintain. Personal relationships failed to develop in the way he desperately wanted. The distance between the person he believed he should become and the person staring back at him in the mirror seemed to grow wider with every passing month. That gap became the center of his world. Instead of searching outward for connection, he retreated inward. The internet became both companion and audience. There, hidden behind screens and usernames, frustration often found reinforcement instead of challenge. Communities built around resentment offered explanations for personal failures. Loneliness transformed into shared anger. Disappointment became evidence of imagined injustice. For someone already struggling with emotional stability, those spaces did not provide solutions. They provided validation. Again and again, Jake recorded videos in which exhaustion filled both his words and his expression. He spoke about feeling trapped inside a life that refused to improve. He described himself as a failure. He drifted between self-pity and bitterness, between blaming himself and blaming the world around him. Sometimes his voice sounded defeated. Other times it carried flashes of quiet rage. Neither emotion stayed for long before giving way to another. Looking back, investigators would describe a young man whose mental state appeared increasingly fragile. Yet fragility alone never explains violence. Across Britain, thousands of people struggle with depression, loneliness, rejection, and hopelessness without harming anyone else. Emotional pain is not destiny. The story of Plymouth is not the story of mental illness alone. Nor is it simply the story of extremist online communities. Nor solely about firearms. It is the story of several warning signs gradually intersecting until they formed something catastrophically dangerous. That distinction matters. Because reducing tragedy to a single cause risks overlooking every opportunity that existed before the first shot was fired. Months before August 2021, Jake Davison had already attracted police attention following an incident involving violence within his own family. Authorities seized his shotgun. For many observers after the shooting, that decision appeared to represent a moment where catastrophe had been avoided. But only temporarily. Following reviews and assessments, the firearm was eventually returned. His certificate allowing him to possess the weapon was reinstated. At the time, that administrative decision passed without public attention. No headlines appeared. No television debates followed. No one imagined that paperwork completed inside offices would later become one of the most scrutinized decisions in modern British policing. The shotgun returned to its owner. Life continued. Until it didn't. If tragedy has one cruel characteristic, it is patience. It often waits quietly. Nothing dramatic happened immediately after the firearm was returned. There were no immediate attacks. No emergency calls. No public threats. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The apparent normality encouraged the comforting belief that everything had worked exactly as intended. But beneath that calm surface, Jake Davison's inner world continued to deteriorate. His online activity increasingly reflected hopelessness. He discussed physical appearance, social rejection, masculinity, and failure with an intensity suggesting these subjects dominated his thoughts. He referred to communities associated with the so-called incel movement, where feelings of resentment toward women and society often mixed with personal despair. Investigators later examined these materials carefully. They found no evidence that he belonged to an organized terrorist network. No sophisticated ideological plot. No elaborate manifesto announcing political objectives. Instead, they encountered something perhaps even more unsettling. A young man becoming progressively detached from reality while convincing himself that life had already defeated him. Despair does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it accumulates quietly. One disappointment becomes another. One rejection follows the last. One lonely evening blends into hundreds more. Eventually, tomorrow begins to look identical to yesterday. Hope shrinks. Anger expands. Perspective narrows. By the time other people notice, the emotional collapse may already be far advanced. Neighbors who knew Jake Davison would later struggle to reconcile the headlines with the young man they occasionally saw walking through the area. He was not widely known as someone constantly causing disturbances. He was simply another resident. Someone pushing a shopping trolley through local supermarkets. Someone waiting at bus stops. Someone passing strangers without attracting attention. The ordinary appearance of extraordinary violence has always disturbed investigators. People often imagine monsters as visibly different from everyone else. History repeatedly proves otherwise. The individuals responsible for terrible crimes frequently blend seamlessly into everyday environments until the moment they decide not to. That uncomfortable reality haunted Keyham. Residents searched their memories for clues. Did he seem different? Did anyone notice something unusual? Was there one conversation that now sounded like a warning? Human memory naturally searches backward after catastrophe. It wants to believe disaster could have been predicted. Sometimes it could. Sometimes it couldn't. The Plymouth shootings occupy a painful space between those possibilities. There were warning signs. There were interventions. There were missed opportunities. Yet there remained no certainty that anyone standing inside those moments truly understood where they would eventually lead. As evening approached on August 12th, none of the future victims had any reason to think about Jake Davison. Their lives moved along entirely separate paths. Maxine Davison remained inside the family home. Lee Martin devoted his attention to his young daughter, Sophie, whose world was still measured in playgrounds, cartoons, and bedtime stories rather than fear. Stephen Washington prepared for another ordinary walk with his dog, a familiar routine repeated countless times before. Kate Shepherd spent the evening exactly as thousands of other people across Britain spent theirs, expecting tomorrow to arrive just like every other Friday. Every one of them believed they had time. Time to finish conversations. Time to make plans. Time to see family again. Time has a way of feeling unlimited until the instant it isn't. Investigators would eventually reconstruct the events of that evening minute by minute. Digital evidence. Witness statements. Emergency calls. Forensic analysis. Ballistics. Medical examinations. Each piece added another fragment to the truth. But before all of those documents existed, before official reports filled hundreds of pages, there was only confusion. Confusion spreading faster than information. People heard noises they could not identify. Some froze. Others ran. Several instinctively looked outside, trying to understand why frightened voices suddenly echoed through streets that moments earlier had been peaceful. No one immediately understood they were witnessing history. History rarely introduces itself. It simply begins. Inside one ordinary house on Biddick Drive, a confrontation was already unfolding behind closed doors. Words spoken in anger. Emotions pushed beyond restraint. Years of unresolved conflict compressed into a single evening. No neighbors could see through the walls. No passerby understood that, within minutes, the violence inside that house would spill onto the streets outside and forever change the identity of an entire community. The clock continued moving forward with complete indifference. Each second brought August 12th closer to the point from which there would be no return. Outside, the neighborhood remained unaware. Inside, a decision was about to be made that could never be undone. There is a moment before every catastrophe when the world still has the opportunity to remain ordinary. A single minute. A single decision. A single breath. If time could be rewound to that evening in Keyham, no one standing in the streets would recognize it as the final moments of normal life. The roads looked exactly as they had the day before. The rows of brick houses stood quietly beneath the fading August sky, their windows reflecting the last traces of daylight. Gardens were neatly trimmed. Cars were parked where they had always been. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that, within moments, it would become the center of one of the darkest chapters in modern British criminal history. That is what makes tragedies like Plymouth so profoundly unsettling. They do not erupt in places already consumed by violence. They emerge in places where people believe tomorrow is guaranteed. For decades, Britain had lived with some of the strictest firearm regulations in the world. Following previous national tragedies, sweeping changes to gun laws had dramatically reduced the likelihood of mass shootings. Entire generations had grown up believing that incidents regularly seen in other countries were tragedies that happened somewhere else. Not here. Not in neighborhoods like Keyham. Not on quiet residential streets where children learned to ride bicycles and elderly couples greeted one another every morning. When news alerts began spreading across the country later that evening, many people initially assumed there had been some mistake. A shooting. Several victims. In Plymouth. The words themselves felt unnatural. The city was known for its maritime history, its naval base, its coastline, and its close-knit communities. It was not known for indiscriminate violence. Residents often described it as a place where life moved at a slower pace than in Britain's largest cities. Families settled there seeking stability. Neighbors still recognized familiar faces in local shops. Community events filled parks during the summer months. The contrast between that peaceful identity and the events of August 12th would become impossible to ignore. Yet before the headlines, before the investigations, before the public inquiries, there were only ordinary people living ordinary lives. That is where every true crime story truly begins. Not with the killer, but with the lives that existed before violence interrupted them. Every victim in Plymouth had a story stretching far beyond the 6 minutes that would later dominate newspaper front pages. Each had experienced decades of birthdays, friendships, disappointments, celebrations, quiet mornings, and hopeful plans. Those lives cannot be measured by the moment they ended. They deserve to be remembered by everything that came before. The investigation would eventually assign every movement a precise timestamp. Emergency services would document every location. Forensic specialists would measure distances down to the smallest detail. Crime scene investigators would photograph every piece of evidence before carefully collecting it. Lawyers would later examine every decision. Journalists would analyze every known fact. Public inquiries would spend months asking whether the tragedy could have been prevented. But long before any official record existed, grief had already arrived. Grief does not wait for evidence. It does not wait for confirmation. It arrives the moment someone realizes a loved one is not coming home. Some families first sensed something was wrong when unanswered phone calls stretched longer than expected. Others learned through frantic messages exchanged between friends and neighbors. For many residents, the first indication that something unimaginable had happened came from the growing presence of emergency vehicles converging on streets that normally saw little more than local traffic. Blue lights reflected against familiar houses. Roads were closed. Confusion spread from one household to the next. Questions traveled faster than answers. People opened front doors only to find neighbors asking the very same thing. What happened? No one knew. Not yet. Inside police control rooms, operators struggled to piece together fragments of information arriving from frightened callers. Reports differed. Some described one victim. Others believed several people had been shot. The exact location appeared uncertain. Descriptions of the suspect changed from one call to another. Panic has a way of distorting perception. Witnesses remember different details. Distances become difficult to judge. Time itself seems to accelerate. Investigators would later rely upon dozens of separate accounts to reconstruct those critical minutes, carefully comparing each statement until a coherent sequence finally emerged. Only then did the horrifying simplicity of the attack become clear. There had been no lengthy pursuit. No elaborate escape plan. No negotiation. Just a brief explosion of violence that permanently altered countless lives. As detectives continued examining Jake Davison's background, they discovered a portrait that resisted simple explanation. He was neither a lifelong career criminal nor someone completely unknown to authorities. He occupied an uneasy middle ground. A young man with documented warning signs. A young man whose emotional struggles had become increasingly visible. A young man whose access to a legally owned firearm would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. In the weeks and months after the shooting, public discussion often searched for a single answer. People wanted one clear cause. One mistake. One individual to blame. Reality proved more complicated. The story that emerged was one of overlapping failures, personal deterioration, and missed opportunities rather than a single catastrophic error. That complexity does not lessen responsibility. Nor does it diminish the suffering endured by the victims and their families. Instead, it reveals how devastating tragedies often develop through layers of circumstances that, taken individually, may not appear extraordinary until they converge. The Plymouth shootings forced Britain to confront uncomfortable questions that reached far beyond one neighborhood. How should warning signs be interpreted before violence occurs? What responsibilities do authorities carry when balancing individual rights with public safety? How should online communities promoting resentment and hopelessness be understood? When does emotional isolation become a genuine threat rather than a private struggle? These questions had no easy answers then. They still do not. Perhaps that is why the case continues to resonate years later. It was not only an act of violence. It became a mirror reflecting broader concerns about loneliness, mental health, online radicalization, institutional decision-making, and the limits of prevention. Yet behind every national conversation remained something far more personal. 5 families grieving loved ones who would never return. Friends trying to understand conversations that suddenly became final. A community attempting to reclaim streets forever associated with unimaginable loss. The headlines eventually faded. Breaking news became archived reports. Television crews packed away their cameras. Police cordons disappeared. Traffic resumed. Children slowly returned to playgrounds. Life, as it always does, continued moving forward. But moving forward is not the same as moving on. For many people in Keyham, August 12, 2021, became a dividing line in memory. There was life before that evening. And there was life after it. Everything that followed would forever be measured against those 6 irreversible minutes. This story is not about glorifying a killer or dwelling on notoriety. It is about understanding how an ordinary summer evening transformed into a national tragedy, how innocent lives became intertwined by senseless violence, and how a community faced the impossible task of rebuilding after profound loss. To understand that transformation, we must return to the beginning, not to the gunshots that echoed through Keyham, but to the lives quietly unfolding before anyone realized the ordinary was about to disappear. Because every tragedy has a first moment. Not the first shot. The first unnoticed step toward it. And in Plymouth, that journey began long before the evening of August 12, 2021. The road toward those 6 devastating minutes was paved over months and years, through personal struggles, fractured relationships, overlooked warning signs, and decisions that, at the time, seemed isolated from one another. Only when viewed together would they reveal the full picture of how an ordinary neighborhood became the setting for an extraordinary tragedy. That is where our story truly begins. The city of Plymouth has always lived with the sea. Long before it became known around the world for a tragedy that lasted only 6 minutes, it was a place where tides dictated the rhythm of everyday life. Fishing boats drifted in and out of the harbor before sunrise. Royal Navy vessels stood as constant reminders of the city's centuries-old relationship with Britain's maritime history. Tourists wandered along the historic Barbican, photographing narrow cobbled streets and colorful waterfront buildings, while local families gathered on the Hoe to watch the sun disappear behind Plymouth Sound. To millions of people across the United Kingdom, Plymouth represented history, resilience, and quiet coastal living. It was never supposed to become synonymous with mass murder. Located in the county of Devon, in England's southwest, Plymouth was home to more than 250,000 people. It was large enough to feel like a city, yet small enough that many neighborhoods retained a close-knit identity. Residents often described life there as slower than in London, Birmingham, or Manchester. Rush hour rarely lasted long. Familiar faces appeared in local supermarkets, cafes, and bus stops. Generations of families remained in the same communities, sometimes living only a few streets apart. One of those communities was Keyham. From above, Keyham looked remarkably ordinary. Rows of modest terraced houses stretched along narrow residential roads. Small front gardens separated homes from the pavement by only a few feet. Children's bicycles leaned against brick walls. Hanging baskets filled with flowers decorated porches during the summer months. Cars were parked tightly along both sides of the streets, leaving only enough space for cautious traffic to pass between them. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested danger. It was not wealthy. Neither was it defined by extreme poverty. Like many working-class communities across Britain, Keyham carried a mixture of pride and hardship. Some residents had spent their entire lives there. Others arrived because housing remained comparatively affordable. Parents worked long hours. Grandparents helped care for children after school. Local shops survived because customers often knew the owners by name. It was the kind of place where people noticed unfamiliar faces. Ironically, on the evening of August 12, the face responsible for unimaginable violence belonged to someone everyone considered familiar. Jake Davison did not arrive from another city. He did not cross national borders. He lived only a few doors away from where the horror would begin. That reality shattered one of the community's deepest assumptions that danger usually comes from outside. Instead, it emerged from within. Biddick Drive was an unremarkable residential street. Brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder, each almost identical to the next. The gardens were modest but carefully maintained. Children's toys occasionally rested near front doors. Recycling bins lined the pavements on collection days. Delivery drivers passed through without giving the area a second thought. There were no warning signs visible from the outside. No abandoned property. No graffiti suggesting unrest. No obvious indication that one address concealed years of growing emotional turmoil. Behind one of those front doors lived Jake Davison and his mother, Maxine. Neighbors later described seeing them from time to time, exchanging brief greetings much like any other residents. Their relationship, however, was far more complicated than casual observations could reveal. Like many parents of adult children facing personal difficulties, Maxine appeared to carry the impossible burden of wanting to help while struggling to understand how. Outside observers rarely witness the quiet conflicts that unfold inside family homes. Arguments remain behind closed doors. Disappointments stay private. Love and frustration often exist side by side. From the street, everything appears normal. Inside, the reality can be very different. Jake Davison was 22 years old. An age often associated with possibility. For many young adults, 22 is a time of university graduation, beginning careers, forming lasting relationships, or imagining the future with optimism. Jake's life had taken a different path. He worked intermittently in manual labor and warehouse jobs, never establishing the stable direction he appeared to crave. Financial uncertainty added pressure to an already fragile emotional state. His social circle gradually narrowed. Friendships became less frequent. Romantic relationships remained absent. To outsiders, these circumstances might have appeared disappointing but hardly extraordinary. Thousands of young people struggle to find direction in their early 20s. What separated Jake was not simply disappointment. It was how deeply disappointment began defining his identity. Rather than seeing setbacks as temporary obstacles, he increasingly viewed them as permanent proof that life itself had rejected him. That mindset became visible through his online presence. Across various video uploads and online discussions, Jake spoke candidly about loneliness, insecurity, physical appearance, and the feeling that he had somehow fallen behind everyone else his age. Sometimes he attempted humor. Sometimes he sounded reflective. More often, however, an unmistakable exhaustion lingered beneath every sentence. He frequently described waking each morning with little expectation that anything meaningful would change. His words painted the portrait of someone watching life happen around him instead of participating in it. The internet became the place where those emotions found expression. Modern loneliness often unfolds differently than it once did. Previous generations experienced isolation in silence. Today's isolation can be broadcast to thousands of strangers. Videos replace conversations. Comments replace friendships. Algorithms replace communities. For someone searching desperately for belonging, online spaces can become substitutes for real human connection. Sometimes those spaces offer support. Sometimes they amplify despair. Jake gradually found himself consuming content that reinforced his darkest beliefs about society and his place within it. He expressed sympathy for ideas commonly associated with the online incel movement, a loose network built around resentment, rejection, and the belief that certain men are unfairly excluded from romantic relationships and social acceptance. It is important to understand that these online communities are not defined by one single ideology. Many members never commit crimes. Many never become violent. Yet investigators would later conclude that exposure to these ideas formed part of Jake's increasingly distorted worldview. The communities did not create every problem in his life. But they offered explanations that redirected personal frustration outward. Instead of asking how life could improve, conversations often centered on why improvement seemed impossible. Instead of encouraging resilience, many discussions rewarded bitterness. Each disappointment became evidence supporting a larger narrative of hopelessness. Gradually, despair stopped feeling temporary. It became identity. Meanwhile, everyday life in Keyham continued without noticing the transformation unfolding behind computer screens. Children walked to school. Workers caught early buses. Neighbors discussed rising grocery prices and football results. Parents worried about homework, mortgages, and medical appointments. Nobody could see the private world developing inside Jake's mind. Even those closest to him struggled to understand the full extent of his emotional deterioration. Mental collapse rarely announces itself dramatically. It often hides beneath ordinary routines. Someone still goes shopping, still walks the dog, still says hello to neighbors, still appears at family gatherings. The outside remains recognizable while the inside changes almost beyond recognition. Jake's appearance reflected little of what investigators would later uncover. Photographs show a young man with a stocky build, short hair, and an expression that often appeared subdued rather than aggressive. Nothing about those images suggested the face of Britain's deadliest mass shooter in more than 10 years. That contrast would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Violence did not wear an obvious disguise. It looked like someone who might stand quietly beside you in a checkout line at the supermarket. As the months passed, warning signs accumulated. Not dramatic enough individually to predict mass murder, but significant enough that, viewed together after the tragedy, they formed a deeply troubling pattern. Jake's emotional struggles intensified. His relationship with his mother became increasingly strained. His online videos reflected growing pessimism. His contact with authorities following an earlier violent incident raised concerns serious enough for police to temporarily seize his shotgun. Yet life continued. The neighborhood carried on as it always had. Summer arrived. Gardens bloomed. Children laughed in nearby parks. Residents planned weekends with family and friends. No one imagined that the greatest danger facing Keyham did not come from some unknown threat beyond the community. It lived quietly behind the walls of an ordinary brick house on Biddick Drive, waiting for an evening in August when years of anger, isolation, and despair would erupt into irreversible violence. The story of Keyham cannot be understood without understanding the lives of the people who called it home. Unlike city centers filled with constant movement, Keyham possessed a rhythm that changed very little from one week to the next. Morning commuters left before sunrise. School children filled the sidewalks for a brief hour before classrooms claimed their attention. By late afternoon, the streets became quieter again as elderly residents tended to their gardens while parents waited for children to return home. Evenings were often marked by little more than the distant sound of traffic and the occasional train passing through the nearby railway line. It was a community built on familiarity. Many families had lived there for decades. Children grew into adults without ever moving far away. Grandparents often lived only a few streets from their grandchildren. Birthday celebrations, neighborhood barbecues, and casual conversations across garden fences created invisible threads that held the community together. Those threads would be violently torn apart on August 12th. To understand why the tragedy felt so deeply personal, it is important to remember that the victims were not anonymous strangers passing through the city. They were neighbors. People whose faces appeared regularly in local shops. People who exchanged greetings on morning walks. People whose absence would be noticed immediately. Among them was Maxine Davison. To the public, she would forever be remembered as the gunman's mother. But that single description erased an entire lifetime that existed long before the tragedy. She was 51 years old. She had experienced the ordinary challenges of raising a family, managing a household, and supporting a son whose life had become increasingly complicated. Like countless parents, she occupied the difficult space between love and frustration. Family relationships are rarely simple, particularly when an adult child struggles with emotional instability. There are moments of hope, moments of disappointment, and moments when every conversation feels as though it could either heal old wounds or deepen them. No outsider can fully know what passed between mother and son during the months leading to that August evening. What investigators would later establish is that tension had become an undeniable part of their relationship. Arguments occurred. Emotions frequently ran high. Yet despite those difficulties, they continued living under the same roof. For many parents, love is measured not only by joyful moments but also by the willingness to continue hoping when hope becomes increasingly difficult. Whatever dreams Maxine once carried for her son's future had almost certainly changed over the years. Perhaps she hoped he would eventually find stable work. Perhaps she hoped he would meet someone who would bring happiness into his life. Perhaps she simply hoped tomorrow would be calmer than today. Those hopes ended inside her own home. Not because she stopped believing, but because violence arrived before tomorrow did. Only a short distance away lived another family preparing for an evening together. Lee Martin was 43 years old. Friends described him as a devoted father whose greatest joy centered on his daughter, Sophie. Parenthood often transforms the smallest routines into treasured memories. A short walk becomes an adventure. A trip to the local park becomes an opportunity for laughter. An ordinary Thursday evening becomes another chance to spend precious time with a child who is growing a little more every single day. Lee never imagined that one of those ordinary moments would become his last. Sophie Martin was only 3 years old. At that age, the world remains wonderfully uncomplicated. Children do not measure life in years. They measure it in bedtime stories, favorite toys, ice cream on warm afternoons, and the comforting certainty that their parents will always be there. A 3-year-old cannot understand hatred, cannot recognize danger approaching from the opposite side of the street, cannot imagine that adults are capable of senseless cruelty. Sophie's world was still defined by innocence. That innocence became one of the most heartbreaking symbols of the Plymouth shootings. Across Britain, her photograph appeared on newspaper front pages, reminding the nation that the youngest victim had barely begun experiencing life. People who had never met her struggled to comprehend how someone so young could become caught in such unimaginable violence. Parents hugged their own children a little tighter. Many admitted that Sophie's death affected them differently from every other detail of the case. Because every child represents possibility. An unwritten future. An entire lifetime waiting to unfold. That future disappeared in seconds. Elsewhere in Keyham, Stephen Washington prepared for another evening walk. He was 59 years old. Like so many dog owners, walking had become part of his daily routine rather than a special event. Familiar streets required little thought. The route rarely changed. Neighbors recognized both him and his dog. Such routines create a quiet sense of comfort because they suggest that tomorrow will resemble today. Routine offers reassurance. Until routine unexpectedly intersects with chaos. Stephen had no connection to Jake Davison. He was not involved in any dispute. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The same was true for Kate Shepard. At 66, she had spent decades building a life filled with ordinary experiences shared by millions of people, family gatherings, friendships, celebrations, disappointments, and the countless everyday moments that rarely make headlines but ultimately define a person's life. On the evening of August 12th, she stood outside a local hair salon. There was nothing remarkable about the moment. No warning. No confrontation. No argument. Only an ordinary woman standing in an ordinary place before an extraordinary act of violence ended everything. One of the cruelest realities of indiscriminate attacks is their complete disregard for personal history. They do not ask who someone is. They do not consider dreams, kindness, or sacrifice. They erase people without ever knowing them. That truth would become painfully clear as investigators reconstructed Jake Davison's movements. Most of his victims had never spoken to him. Some almost certainly had never even noticed him before that evening. Yet their lives became permanently connected through circumstances none of them could control. Meanwhile, life continued elsewhere across Plymouth. Families prepared dinner. Teenagers watched television. Workers finished evening shifts. People laughed in restaurants overlooking the harbor. Tourists admired the sunset over the water. The city itself remained blissfully unaware that one neighborhood was approaching catastrophe. That contrast is perhaps the most haunting feature of every localized tragedy. While unimaginable suffering unfolds in one small corner of the world, ordinary life continues almost unchanged only a few miles away. The sun still sets. Traffic lights still change. Shops still close at their usual time. History often arrives quietly, unnoticed by those standing just outside its path. Inside the Davison household, however, calm had already begun to disappear. The relationship between Jake and his mother had deteriorated under the weight of years of emotional strain. Investigators would later determine that the confrontation on August 12 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of tensions that had been building long before that evening. Arguments inside families are common. Violence is not. There exists a boundary that most people never cross, no matter how intense the disagreement becomes. On that August evening, Jake Davison crossed it. Once that boundary disappeared, the tragedy no longer belonged only to one household. Within minutes, it would spill beyond the walls of the family home and into the streets of Keyham, carrying with it consequences that would forever alter the lives of everyone who called that neighborhood home. As the summer of 2021 unfolded, Britain was emerging from one of the most uncertain periods in recent history. The COVID-19 pandemic had changed daily life in ways few people could have imagined. Months of lockdowns, social distancing, economic uncertainty, and prolonged isolation had left visible and invisible scars across the country. Businesses struggled to recover. Families mourned loved ones. Young adults found themselves entering a world where opportunities suddenly seemed fewer than they had only a year before. For many people, the pandemic was an inconvenience. For others, it became an amplifier. Loneliness grew deeper. Financial worries became heavier. Existing mental health struggles became more difficult to manage. Researchers would later describe this period as one in which countless vulnerable individuals experienced a profound sense of disconnection from society. Jake Davison was one of those individuals. That does not explain his actions. Nor does it excuse them. Millions of people endured the same hardships without resorting to violence. The pandemic was not the cause of the Plymouth shootings. But it formed part of the wider environment in which Jake's already fragile emotional state continued to deteriorate. He appeared increasingly convinced that life had reached a dead end. His online videos became windows into that mindset. Sitting alone in front of a camera, he often spoke with a flat, defeated expression. His words drifted from disappointment to frustration, from frustration to resentment, and then back again. He discussed feeling trapped inside circumstances he believed he could not change. He complained about his appearance, his lack of success with relationships, and his inability to build the future he had imagined for himself. What made those recordings unsettling was not dramatic outbursts. They were often quiet, almost conversational. The exhaustion in his voice carried more weight than anger. It sounded like someone who had stopped expecting tomorrow to be better than today. He frequently compared his own life with the lives of others. Friends appeared happier. Strangers seemed more successful. People his own age looked as though they were moving forward while he remained standing still. That constant comparison gradually distorted his perspective. Instead of recognizing the carefully edited reality presented across social media, he interpreted it as proof that everyone else had found happiness while he alone had been left behind. Isolation has a dangerous habit of narrowing vision. The smaller a person's world becomes, the larger every disappointment appears. Without healthy relationships to challenge destructive thinking, negative beliefs begin reinforcing themselves. One hopeless thought produces another. One lonely evening becomes another sleepless night. Days blur together. Eventually, despair no longer feels temporary. It feels permanent. Somewhere within that emotional collapse, Jake began searching for explanations. The internet provided thousands. Algorithms rarely distinguish between healthy curiosity and emotional vulnerability. They simply recommend more of whatever captures a user's attention. Watch one video about loneliness. Another appears. Then another. Soon the viewer enters communities where personal disappointment is interpreted through increasingly distorted ideas about society, relationships, masculinity, and identity. Jake's online activity reflected that progression. Investigators later concluded that he had consumed material associated with the so-called incel subculture, where resentment toward women and broader society often mixed with fatalism and self-loathing. It is important to understand what that finding did and did not mean. The official investigation did not classify the Plymouth shootings as an act of terrorism. Nor did it conclude that Jake acted under the direction of any organized extremist group. Rather, Investigators found that his worldview had become influenced by online communities that reinforced hopelessness, anger, and alienation while offering few paths toward recovery. The internet had not pulled the trigger, but it had become one of the places where despair found encouragement instead of resistance. Away from the digital world, another reality was unfolding. Jake's relationship with his mother continued to deteriorate. Family members often carry the greatest burden when someone close to them experiences emotional decline. They become caregivers without training, counselors without qualifications, and emotional anchors despite carrying their own fears and exhaustion. Love alone is rarely enough. Many families facing similar circumstances describe living with constant uncertainty. Every conversation feels unpredictable. Every disagreement carries the hope that it will end peacefully. Every calm day offers temporary relief before another difficult moment arrives. No one outside the home truly sees that struggle. Neighbors hear little. Friends notice only fragments. The hardest battles are often fought behind closed doors. By August 2021, several warning signs had already appeared. Jake had previously come to the attention of police following an incident involving violence. His shotgun had been confiscated. For a time, it seemed that an important safeguard had been put in place. Yet after further review, the firearm was returned and his shotgun certificate was reinstated. That administrative decision would later become one of the central questions surrounding the entire tragedy. With hindsight, the outcome appears devastatingly clear. Without hindsight, the decision belonged to a process designed to assess risk based on the information available at the time. That distinction would become a painful focus of later inquiries. Could more have been done? Were warning signs underestimated? Did institutional failures contribute to what happened? Those questions would dominate public debate for years. But on the evening of August 12, none of those debates existed. There was only an ordinary Thursday drawing slowly toward night. The sky above Plymouth softened into the warm colors of late summer. Shadows lengthened across the brick houses of Keyham. Lights began appearing in living room windows as families settled indoors. Some people prepared tea. Others watched the evening news. Children played for a few more minutes before bedtime. It was a scene repeated across thousands of British neighborhoods. The ordinary rhythm of life continued uninterrupted. Inside one house on Biddick Drive, however, the atmosphere was changing. The tension that had accumulated over months and years was approaching its breaking point. No one walking past the house could have sensed it. No passing driver slowed to look. Nothing visible from the outside suggested that one family argument was about to ignite a tragedy that would leave 5 innocent people dead, 2 others seriously injured, and an entire nation searching for answers. History often feels inevitable after it has happened. In reality, it unfolds one ordinary moment at a time. One conversation. One decision. One door closing. One person choosing a path from which there is no return. The people of Keyham still believed they were living through another uneventful evening. Within minutes, that belief would be shattered forever. The story was no longer moving quietly beneath the surface. It was about to erupt into the 6 minutes that would change Plymouth forever. Every victim in this story had a name long before they became a headline. That simple truth is easy to forget. When people remember the Plymouth shootings, they often remember the number first. 5 people killed. 2 seriously injured. 1 gunman. 6 minutes of unimaginable violence. Numbers are efficient. They are also deeply unfair. Because numbers cannot tell us who laughed the loudest during family gatherings. They cannot describe the quiet routines that made someone feel at home. They cannot explain the dreams that remained unfinished or the ordinary acts of kindness that rarely attract attention but leave lasting impressions on those fortunate enough to receive them. Before they became victims, they were mothers and fathers, daughters and friends, neighbors and grandparents. They were people whose lives mattered long before they crossed paths with violence. And perhaps nowhere is that truth more heartbreaking than in the story of Maxine Davison. History will always remember her as the first victim. But to those who knew her, she was never simply that. She was a woman who had spent much of her adult life carrying responsibilities that rarely appeared in photographs or newspaper articles. Raising a family is rarely dramatic. It is measured in thousands of ordinary sacrifices that often go unnoticed. Early mornings, late nights, endless conversations, worries that remain unspoken, and hopes quietly placed upon the future of a child. Parents rarely stop being parents simply because their children become adults. The worries change. The responsibilities change. The love does not. For years, Maxine had watched her son struggle. The young boy she had once raised had become a young man increasingly trapped by frustration, disappointment, and emotional instability. No parent imagines that the child they comfort after nightmares will one day become someone they themselves fear. Yet life does not always follow the gentle path parents envision. Families facing mental health struggles often exist within a complicated emotional landscape. Love coexists with exhaustion. Hope survives alongside disappointment. Arguments erupt, apologies follow, and tomorrow always carries the possibility that things might finally improve. There is no evidence to suggest that Maxine had given up on her son. If anything, the opposite appears true. They still lived together. That simple fact speaks volumes. Sharing a home with an adult child experiencing significant emotional difficulties is rarely easy. It demands patience that often goes unseen by the outside world. Every disagreement risks reopening old wounds. Every peaceful day becomes something quietly treasured. Neighbors later remembered nothing extraordinary about the house. It looked like every other home on Biddick Drive. Curtains drawn at night. A front garden like dozens of others. People coming and going without attracting attention. From the outside, it represented normal family life. Inside, the reality was undoubtedly more complicated. No one except those living there truly understood the emotional weight carried through those rooms. The tragedy that unfolded within that house would forever prevent anyone from hearing Maxine's side of the story. We will never know the hopes she carried into that final evening. Perhaps she believed another argument would eventually fade as previous ones had. Perhaps she hoped tomorrow would offer another chance to repair a fractured relationship. Perhaps she simply expected an ordinary Thursday night to end with another sunrise. Instead, it became the last evening of her life. Not because she had done anything wrong. Not because she had chosen danger. But because violence entered the very place where every person expects to be safest. Home. There is something uniquely devastating about crimes committed inside family homes. A house is more than walls and furniture. It is where birthdays are celebrated. Where children learn their first words. Where photographs accumulate across years. Where ordinary evenings slowly become lifelong memories. When violence erupts inside that space, it destroys more than lives. It destroys the meaning of home itself. For investigators entering the property later that evening, it was immediately clear that the tragedy had begun there. The first chapter of the Plymouth shootings was not written on a public street. It began behind a closed front door. Long before strangers became victims, one family had already been shattered beyond repair. As heartbreaking as Maxine's story is, she was not the only life forever interrupted that evening. Only a short distance away, another family was experiencing what should have been one of countless ordinary evenings together. Lee Martin was 43 years old. Those who knew him consistently described someone devoted to his family, particularly to his young daughter. Fatherhood often reshapes the way people measure time. Life is no longer divided by careers or achievements. Instead, it becomes measured by first words, first steps, birthdays, school photographs, bedtime stories, and tiny moments that appear insignificant until years later. Every parent understands how quickly childhood disappears. One day a child asks to be carried. Soon afterward they insist on walking by themselves. The years move faster than anyone expects. Parents know this better than anyone. Perhaps that is why they treasure even the smallest routines. An evening walk. A trip to the park. Holding a tiny hand while crossing the road. Listening to endless questions only a curious child could ask. These moments rarely appear extraordinary. Yet they become life's greatest treasures. On August 12th, Lee Martin set out with his daughter just as countless parents had done before him. There was no reason to believe this walk would be different. No instinct warning him to stay inside. No sign that danger was approaching. The streets belonged to familiarity. His daughter was beside him. It was simply another evening together. 3-year-old Sophie Martin viewed the world through eyes untouched by fear. Children that young possess a remarkable ability to find wonder in almost everything. A butterfly crossing the pavement. A dog wagging its tail. Clouds drifting slowly overhead. Every ordinary object becomes an adventure waiting to be explored. At 3 years old, life is beautifully uncomplicated. Tomorrow always exists. Parents always return. The world feels safe because every adult nearby seems larger, stronger, and capable of protecting them from anything. Sophie could not possibly understand violence. She had not lived long enough to know that evil sometimes appears without warning. Her world was still built upon complete trust. That innocence is what made her death resonate so profoundly across Britain. When her photograph appeared in newspapers and television broadcasts, millions of people saw more than the youngest victim of a mass shooting. They saw every child, every granddaughter, every niece, every little girl whose future should have stretched decades into the future. Instead, Sophie's story would forever stop at the age of 3. She would never begin school. Never celebrate her 18th birthday. Never discover the person she might have become. Every possibility ended before it truly had the chance to begin. For Lee Martin, there would be no opportunity to protect his daughter from what was coming. Some tragedies move too quickly for courage to change the outcome. The love of a parent is limitless. Time is not. In only a few moments, father and daughter would become forever inseparable in one of the darkest chapters of modern British history. And before the evening was over, 3 more innocent lives, each carrying decades of memories, relationships, and dreams, would unknowingly be drawn into the same senseless act of violence. Their stories, too, deserved to be told long before the world remembered the manner in which they died. Stephen Washington had no idea that the routine he had followed so many times before would become his final journey. There are people whose lives are remembered through extraordinary achievements, and there are others whose legacy is found in the quiet kindness they show every day. Stephen belonged to the second group. At 59 years old, he had built a life defined not by headlines or public recognition, but by consistency. Friends and neighbors knew him as someone dependable, approachable, and easy to talk to. He was the kind of man who would stop to exchange a few words with someone walking in the opposite direction, ask how their family was doing, or spend a few extra moments greeting a familiar dog along the pavement. Those simple interactions rarely make history. Yet they are the very moments that create a community. Every neighborhood has people like Stephen. People whose presence makes a place feel familiar. People who become part of the landscape without anyone consciously realizing it. You expect to see them. Until one day, you don't. Walking his dog was one of those routines that had quietly become part of Stephen's everyday life. Routine has a comforting rhythm. The same streets. The same turns. The same familiar houses. Perhaps the occasional conversation with another dog owner. Perhaps nothing more than the sound of footsteps on the pavement and the gentle pull of a leash. There is peace in repetition. It reminds people that life, despite all its uncertainties, still contains moments they can rely upon. On the evening of August 12th, Stephen stepped outside expecting nothing more than another ordinary walk. The weather offered no warning. The streets offered no warning. The people around him offered no warning. Everything looked exactly as it had countless evenings before. History often disguises itself as routine until the exact moment it changes everything. Stephen had never met Jake Davison in any meaningful way. There was no argument between them. No personal grievance. No shared history. Nothing connected their lives except geography. One happened to live nearby. The other happened to be walking through the neighborhood at the wrong moment. That randomness became one of the most horrifying aspects of the Plymouth shootings. The victims were not selected because of who they were. They were selected because they happened to be there. Random violence leaves behind a different kind of fear. When there is no motive directed toward the victim, everyone begins imagining themselves in the same position. It could have been anyone. A different parent. A different grandparent. A different child. A different neighbor walking home from work. The distance between safety and tragedy becomes frighteningly small. Friends later spoke about Stephen's warmth. About the ordinary conversations they wished they could have one more time. Human beings often underestimate the value of ordinary relationships until those relationships suddenly disappear. We remember birthdays, anniversaries, major milestones. Yet after loss, families frequently discover they miss the smallest moments most. The familiar greeting. The shared cup of tea. The brief phone call asking whether everything is all right. Life is built far more from ordinary moments than extraordinary ones. Stephen's family lost all of those ordinary moments in a matter of seconds. Not far away, another ordinary evening was unfolding. Kate Shepherd was 66 years old. She had already lived through decades of changing Britain. She had witnessed generations grow older, technologies transform everyday life, and neighborhoods evolve around her. Like many people her age, her life was not measured by dramatic events but by family, friendships, familiar places, and routines accumulated over many years. The older people become, the more valuable ordinary days often feel. A visit to the hair salon. Meeting a friend for coffee. Shopping in familiar stores. Watching grandchildren grow. Sharing meals with family. The rhythm slows, but the appreciation deepens. Kate's evening contained nothing remarkable. There was no confrontation. No heated exchange. No indication that she had become part of a story the entire country would soon learn about. She was simply standing outside a local hair salon. An ordinary place. At an ordinary time. Living an ordinary life. That ordinary life ended without warning. When investigators reconstructed the sequence of events, they found no evidence that Jake Davison knew who Kate Shepherd was. He had no personal connection to her. She represented nothing more than another innocent life encountered during his path through Keyham. It is difficult to comprehend the cruelty of that randomness. Criminal investigations often uncover motives rooted in jealousy, revenge, financial gain, or long-standing conflict. Those motives never justify violence. But they at least explain why a specific individual became the target. The Plymouth shootings offered no such explanation. The victims shared no common history. No common workplace. No common dispute. Their only shared characteristic was that they crossed paths with a man whose violence no longer distinguished between strangers and family. For investigators, this fact reinforced the terrifying nature of the attack. Once Jake Davison left his home, the boundaries that normally shape human behavior appeared to disappear completely. The people he encountered ceased to exist as individuals. They became obstacles encountered along his path. That loss of human recognition sits at the center of many acts of indiscriminate violence. The victims become anonymous in the attacker's mind. Yet to everyone else, they remain irreplaceable. Behind every name stood an entire network of people. Parents who lost children. Children who lost parents. Brothers. Sisters. Friends. Colleagues. Neighbors. The 5 people killed that evening represented hundreds of relationships forever changed. Grief spreads outward. It never stops with the individual victim. One death creates dozens of mourners. 5 deaths leave an entire community struggling to understand how life can continue. In the days following the tragedy, flowers began appearing throughout Keyham. Residents who had spoken only occasionally before the shooting now stood together in silence. Candles flickered beneath photographs. Handwritten messages expressed emotions that words could barely contain. Children placed drawings among the bouquets, many of them filled with hearts, rainbows, and simple messages of love. They did not fully understand what had happened. They only understood that adults around them were crying. Communities often reveal their greatest strength during moments of unimaginable pain. People cooked meals for grieving families. Neighbors checked on one another. Strangers embraced without needing introductions. Acts of compassion multiplied in response to unimaginable cruelty. Violence had attempted to shatter the community. Instead, it reminded people why community mattered. But even the strongest communities cannot erase loss. The empty chair remains empty. The unanswered phone remains unanswered. The birthdays still arrive. The anniversaries still return. Life continues. Memory continues with it. The Plymouth shootings lasted only 6 minutes. The grief would last far longer. As investigators documented the lives of each victim, another task unfolded alongside the mourning. Detectives needed to understand not only who had died, but why this tragedy had been allowed to happen at all. Every answer they uncovered seemed to lead toward an even more disturbing question. Could this have been prevented? That question would shape everything that followed. Because while the victims deserved to be remembered for the lives they lived, the public also deserved to understand the chain of events that allowed one troubled young man to turn an ordinary neighborhood into a scene of unimaginable devastation. In the aftermath of every tragedy, there comes a moment when the world begins asking the same impossible question. Why them? It is a question born from grief rather than logic, because logic offers little comfort when lives are taken without reason. Families search through memories, trying to understand whether a different decision, a delayed appointment, or an unexpected change of plans might somehow have altered the outcome. If Lee Martin had chosen a different route. If Stephen Washington had taken his dog out 10 minutes later. If Kate Shepard had remained inside the salon for just a little longer. If Maxine Davison had been able to leave the house before the argument escalated. These thoughts become silent companions to grief. They are impossible to answer. Yet almost every family touched by sudden violence wrestles with them. The truth is both painfully simple and deeply cruel. None of the victims did anything that placed them in danger. They did not make reckless decisions. They did not knowingly enter a threatening situation. They were simply living ordinary lives on an ordinary Thursday evening. That reality transformed the Plymouth shootings into something larger than a local tragedy. It became a reminder that random violence attacks the very assumptions people rely upon every day. We believe our homes are safe. We believe our neighborhoods are familiar. We believe routine protects us because routine has protected us countless times before. When those assumptions are shattered, fear extends far beyond the immediate victims. It reaches every parent walking a child home from school. Every elderly neighbor taking an evening stroll. Every family sitting down for dinner behind an unlocked front door. The people of Keyham would later speak about how familiar places suddenly felt unfamiliar. The same streets remained. The same houses stood exactly where they always had. The same bus stops, gardens, and sidewalks greeted residents every morning. Nothing physical had changed. Everything emotional had. A short walk to the local shop now carried memories impossible to escape. Residents remembered exactly where emergency vehicles had stopped. Exactly where police officers had stood. Exactly where flowers had covered the pavement. Memory quietly reshaped the landscape. Visitors saw an ordinary neighborhood. Residents saw invisible landmarks of loss. This is one of the lasting consequences of public tragedy. The crime scene eventually disappears. The emotional geography remains. Children who were too young to understand the events of August 12th would grow older hearing adults speak about that evening. New families moving into the area would eventually learn why certain memorials existed. The story would become part of the neighborhood's identity, passed from one generation to the next. Yet the people remembered within that story deserve more than to be known only as victims. Maxine Davison was more than the mother of the gunman. She was a woman whose life cannot be reduced to its final moments. Lee Martin was more than a father caught in an unimaginable act of violence. He was someone whose love for his daughter defined far more of his life than the tragedy that ended it. Sophie Martin was more than the youngest victim. She was a little girl whose future contained endless possibilities that will forever remain unknown. Stephen Washington was more than a man walking his dog. He was a neighbor, a friend, and a familiar face whose quiet presence helped shape the community around him. Kate Shepard was more than the final name on a list. She was a woman whose decades of memories, relationships, and experiences mattered long before August 12, 2021. Remembering them only through the manner of their deaths would allow violence to define their entire existence. Their loved ones have always known something different. A person's life is measured by far more than the worst day in someone else's life. As investigators prepared to examine the evidence, they understood that every victim represented far more than a forensic report. Every crime scene photograph corresponded to a family waiting for answers. Every piece of evidence belonged to a story interrupted. Every minute spent reconstructing the timeline carried a responsibility not only to uncover the truth, but to honor those whose voices had been permanently silenced. Outside the police cordons, Britain struggled to understand how such a tragedy could happen. The country had spent decades believing that mass shootings were exceptionally rare. Strict firearm laws, introduced after previous national tragedies, had become a source of reassurance for many people. The events in Plymouth challenged that reassurance. Not because the laws had disappeared, but because one case had exposed the painful reality that no system is infallible. Questions began spreading almost as quickly as the news itself. Who was Jake Davison? Why did he have access to a shotgun? Had anyone recognized the warning signs? Could this have been prevented? Those questions would dominate the investigation for months. Yet before detectives could answer any of them, they first had to establish something far more immediate. Exactly what had happened during those 6 devastating minutes. Every emergency call would need to be reviewed. Every witness interviewed. Every movement documented. Every second accounted for. Somewhere within that sequence lay the complete story of how an ordinary family argument escalated into Britain's deadliest mass shooting in more than a decade. Forensic investigators would soon begin walking through quiet streets that only hours earlier had echoed with panic. Markers would appear on the pavement. Evidence would be carefully photographed, measured, and collected. Doorbell cameras, CCTV footage, mobile phone recordings, witness statements, ballistic evidence, and medical examinations would gradually transform confusion into chronology. The truth would emerge one detail at a time. It would not be simple. It would not be comforting. But it would be necessary. Because understanding the full sequence of events was about far more than assigning responsibility. It was about ensuring that every victim's final moments were understood with accuracy rather than speculation. It was about learning whether opportunities existed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. And above all, it was about replacing rumor with fact. As darkness settled over Plymouth on the evening of August 12, the city was no longer the same place it had been that morning. 5 lives had ended. 2 others had been permanently changed by serious injuries. Dozens of families had entered a lifetime of grief. An entire community had lost its sense of certainty. The questions were only beginning. The answers were still hidden within the streets of Keyham, waiting for investigators to uncover them. That investigation would reveal not only how the attack unfolded, but also the chain of decisions, missed warnings, and critical moments that led to one of the darkest days in modern British history. The story was now leaving the lives of the victims behind. It was entering the crime scene itself, where every fragment of evidence would begin telling the story that the gunfire had left unfinished at 6:05 p.m. Nothing about Biddick Drive suggested that the next 6 minutes would become part of British criminal history. The street looked exactly as it had looked countless evenings before. Cars rested quietly along the curb. Front doors remained open to welcome the last warm air of the day. Curtains shifted gently in upstairs windows as families moved about their homes preparing dinner. Somewhere nearby, a television flickered in a living room. A child laughed in a neighboring garden. A dog barked briefly before falling silent again. It was the kind of ordinary evening that disappears from memory almost as soon as it ends. No one outside number. could see what was happening behind its walls. Inside the house, however, years of tension had reached their breaking point. The relationship between Jake Davison and his mother, Maxine, had become increasingly strained over time. Investigators would later conclude that an argument broke out between them that evening. It was not simply a disagreement over a single issue. Like many family conflicts, it carried the weight of frustrations that had accumulated over months and perhaps years. Words spoken in anger often reveal emotions buried beneath the surface. Disappointment, resentment, fear, hopelessness. No witness would ever hear every word exchanged inside that house. Only fragments could later be reconstructed from forensic evidence and the investigation that followed. What is known is that the confrontation escalated rapidly. At some point during the argument, Jake physically attacked his mother. Investigators later determined that he restrained her and assaulted her before retrieving his shotgun. That sequence matters because it reveals that the violence did not begin the moment the firearm appeared. It had already begun. The gun simply transformed a domestic assault into a mass casualty event. For a brief moment, the tragedy remained confined within the walls of one home. No neighbor knew. No pedestrian passing outside suspected anything unusual. The world beyond the front door continued moving as though nothing had changed. Inside, however, one irreversible decision had already been made. Jake retrieved his legally owned pump-action shotgun. Firearms possess a terrible finality. Arguments can end. Fights can stop. Harsh words can be forgiven. The moment a trigger is pulled, possibility disappears. Investigators believe Maxine had virtually no opportunity to escape. She was shot inside her own home. She was 51 years old. Her life ended in the place where she should have been safest. There was no time for neighbors to intervene. No opportunity for emergency services to arrive. No warning that reached the outside world before it was too late. The first victim had fallen. Yet no one beyond the walls of the house fully understood that the tragedy had only begun. Most mass casualty attacks involve a transition. A moment when violence leaves a private space and enters the public. For the Plymouth shootings, that transition lasted only seconds. Jake opened the front door. He stepped outside carrying the shotgun. The evening sunlight still illuminated the street. Everything appeared deceptively calm. The contrast between the peaceful surroundings and the weapon in his hands could not have been more striking. Witnesses would later describe seeing a man walking with alarming composure. There was no frantic running. No visible panic. His movements appeared deliberate. Measured. Almost detached. That calmness made the unfolding events even more terrifying. People instinctively expect someone committing horrific violence to appear visibly enraged or out of control. Instead, Jake walked into the street with an unsettling sense of purpose. Only a short distance away, Lee Martin was outside with his 3-year-old daughter, Sophie. It should have been an ordinary walk. Perhaps they had spoken moments earlier. Perhaps Sophie had pointed toward something that had caught her attention. Perhaps Lee had smiled, unaware that within seconds he would be forced into a situation no parent could ever imagine. Those final conversations will never be known. The ordinary details vanished with the lives that carried them. Investigators later established that Jake encountered the father and daughter almost immediately after leaving the house. There was no confrontation. No exchange of words. No attempt at communication. The victims had no connection whatsoever to him. They were strangers. Without warning, Jake raised the shotgun. The distance separating them was tragically short. The first shot shattered more than the silence of the evening. It shattered every assumption of safety held by everyone nearby. People initially struggled to understand what they had heard. Britain is not a country where gunfire forms part of everyday experience. Many witnesses later admitted that their minds searched desperately for other explanations. Construction work. Fireworks. Something falling. Anything except what was actually happening. Then another shot followed. And another. Confusion gave way to terror. Lee Martin collapsed. Nearby residents would later describe the overwhelming disbelief that swept through the street. Some froze completely. Others instinctively ducked behind parked cars or walls. Several rushed toward windows before immediately retreating in fear. Parents screamed for children to come inside. Front doors slammed shut one after another. Within moments, an ordinary residential street transformed into a place where survival became the only priority. Little Sophie Martin was only 3 years old. Her father had no realistic opportunity to protect her from what happened. The attack unfolded far too quickly. Emergency responders would later find evidence of just how sudden the violence had been. There had been no chance to run. No chance to hide. Only seconds separated normal life from unimaginable tragedy. For witnesses, those seconds seemed to stretch endlessly. Time behaves strangely during traumatic events. A few moments can feel like several minutes. Small details become permanently engraved in memory. The position of a parked car. The expression on someone's face. The color of the evening sky. Many witnesses would later remember details they wished they could forget. The father. The little girl. The realization that what they were seeing was real. Jake did not stop. He continued moving through the neighborhood. Behind him, devastation already covered the street. Ahead of him waited more innocent lives that had absolutely no idea danger was approaching. The attack was no longer confined to one family. It had become an indiscriminate assault on an entire community. As terrified residents dialed emergency services, information arrived in fragments. Operators heard frightened voices speaking over one another. Reports of multiple people shot. An armed man walking through Keyham. Children involved. The exact number of victims remained unknown. The exact location shifted with every new caller. Police immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Armed response officers were dispatched without delay. But even the fastest response requires time. Time to receive the call. Time to mobilize. Time to travel. During those critical minutes, Jake Davison continued moving through the streets. Each step carried the possibility of another victim. Each passing second widened the tragedy that investigators would later spend months reconstructing. The nightmare unfolding in Keyham was only halfway through. Within moments, the gunman would encounter more strangers whose ordinary Thursday evening was about to end in exactly the same unimaginable way. Jake Davison continued moving through Keyham with a pace that witnesses would later describe as disturbingly calm. There was no sign of hesitation. No indication that the deaths behind him had altered his course. The shotgun remained in his hands as he walked through the neighborhood he had known for years. Houses that had always represented ordinary family life now stood behind hastily closed doors. Curtains twitched as frightened residents risked brief glances outside before disappearing again. Those who realized what was happening instinctively locked their homes, pulled children away from windows, and prayed the armed stranger would keep walking. Fear spread faster than information. Some neighbors had only heard what sounded like loud bangs. Others had caught a glimpse of a man carrying a firearm. Many knew nothing at all. The difference between those who understood the danger and those who did not was measured in seconds. Inside one nearby home, 2 people remained completely unaware that they were about to become victims. A 53-year-old woman and her 33-year-old son were inside their house, shielded by walls that normally represented safety. Like countless families across Britain, they had every reason to believe that being indoors protected them from whatever disturbance might be unfolding outside. Home has always carried an unspoken promise. Whatever happens beyond the front door, these walls will keep us safe. That promise was about to be broken. As Jake moved along the street, he turned his attention toward the house. There was no personal connection between him and the people inside. No argument had ever taken place. No history existed between them. Their lives intersected with his for one reason alone. They happened to be there. Investigators later determined that Jake fired through the window of the property. Glass exploded inward in an instant. Fragments scattered across the room before anyone inside fully understood what was happening. The attack came without warning. No shouted threat. No demand. No opportunity to react. The woman and her son were struck by gunfire before they had any realistic chance to seek cover. For the survivors, those few seconds would remain frozen in memory forever. One moment they were inside their own home. The next, ordinary life had dissolved into terror. Unlike the 5 people who would lose their lives that evening, these 2 victims survived. But survival is not the same as escaping tragedy. Physical injuries heal at different speeds. Psychological trauma often remains long after wounds have closed. The experience of realizing that violence can enter the place where you feel safest changes a person's relationship with the world. Doors no longer feel quite as secure. Unexpected noises carry new meaning. Ordinary evenings become reminders of the night everything changed. Emergency operators continued receiving frantic calls. The picture growing inside the control room became increasingly alarming. Reports now described multiple victims across different locations. This was no longer believed to be an isolated domestic incident. The violence had spread into the community. Armed police accelerated toward Keyham. Officers understood that every minute mattered. Every delay created another opportunity for the gunman to encounter innocent people. Yet geography remained unforgiving. No matter how quickly emergency services responded, they could not arrive before events that had already occurred. Meanwhile, Jake continued walking. Witnesses later described his movements as strangely controlled. He did not appear to be running from police. He did not appear confused. He simply continued forward, carrying the shotgun with an unsettling composure. That image would remain with many residents long after the investigation ended. Several witnesses later spoke about the silence between the gunshots. Those brief pauses were almost as frightening as the blasts themselves. Each silence created uncertainty. Was it over? Had the danger passed? Should they run? Should they stay hidden? Every decision carried unimaginable risk because no one knew where the gunman would appear next. Outside, the neighborhood had transformed completely. Only minutes earlier, people had been walking freely along the pavements. Now the streets emptied with astonishing speed. Parents shouted children back into their homes. Drivers abandoned plans to continue along certain roads after hearing desperate warnings from pedestrians. Some residents hid behind furniture. Others crouched in hallways away from windows, clutching mobile phones while trying to reassure terrified family members. Confusion became the defining emotion. No one possessed the full picture. Every witness saw only one fragment of a much larger nightmare. Jake eventually left the immediate residential area and continued toward a nearby green space. The transition felt almost surreal. One moment he was surrounded by rows of brick houses. The next, open ground stretched before him. Under different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful place. People walked dogs there. Neighbors crossed it on their way home. Children occasionally played nearby. Nothing about the location suggested that it would soon become another crime scene. Stephen Washington was walking his dog. For him, the evening had unfolded exactly as countless evenings before. The familiar route required no special thought. The dog explored familiar scents. The world remained entirely ordinary. There is a heartbreaking simplicity to routines. They exist because yesterday ended safely. They continue because people expect today to end the same way. Stephen had absolutely no reason to expect otherwise. Investigators found no evidence that he recognized the danger before Jake reached him. There was no opportunity for conversation. No chance to escape. No meaningful warning. Jake encountered him and opened fire. The attack lasted only moments. Stephen Washington collapsed where he had been walking only seconds earlier. His dog survived. That detail, though small, remained with many people following the tragedy. Emergency responders arriving later found an animal waiting beside the man who would never again hold its leash. Scenes like that rarely appear in official reports. Yet they reveal the quiet devastation that statistics cannot capture. One life ends. Countless small routines disappear with it. The evening walk. The familiar greeting. The hand reaching for a leash every morning. The absence spreads far beyond the individual. By now, the scale of the attack had become undeniable. Police knew they were responding to an active armed offender moving through a residential area. Medical teams prepared for multiple casualties. Hospitals received warning that seriously injured patients were on the way. Across Keyham, residents remained trapped inside homes, uncertain whether the gunman was still nearby or had already moved on. The fear became almost unbearable. Every distant sound seemed significant. Every passing vehicle drew attention. People refreshed news websites, desperately searching for information that did not yet exist. Friends messaged one another asking the same question. Are you safe? Many messages went unanswered for reasons no one could immediately understand. Some phones lay abandoned beside victims. Others belonged to people hiding silently inside darkened houses. The uncertainty magnified the terror. Jake Davison continued moving. Behind him, 4 people had already lost their lives. 2 others had been gravely injured. Ahead of him, one final innocent stranger was about to unknowingly cross his path. The 6 minutes that would forever define the Plymouth shootings were approaching their final and most devastating moments. The final moments of the attack unfolded with the same terrifying randomness that had defined everything before them. There was no destination. No carefully planned objective waiting at the end of Jake Davison's path. Only another ordinary street. Another ordinary evening. Another innocent person who had absolutely no connection to the violence already unfolding behind him. As Jake continued toward Henderson Place, panic had begun spreading through Keyham faster than he could walk. Some residents had barricaded themselves inside their homes. Others whispered urgently into mobile phones, trying to explain what they themselves barely understood. Police control room operators continued receiving desperate calls from frightened witnesses whose voices often trembled so violently that addresses had to be repeated several times before they could be understood. The picture inside the command center was becoming clearer. An armed man. Multiple victims. The suspect still moving. The highest level of urgency. Every available armed response unit was converging on the area. But those few minutes felt impossibly long for everyone trapped inside them. At Henderson Place, 66-year-old Kate Shepard had no idea that the violence sweeping across the neighborhood was only seconds away. Like every other victim before her, she had no relationship with Jake Davison. No disagreement. No history. No reason to fear him. She was simply standing outside a local hair salon, living an ordinary evening that should have ended with nothing more remarkable than returning home. Investigators later determined that Jake approached the area carrying the shotgun openly. Witnesses who saw him described the same unsettling impression repeated throughout the investigation. He did not appear frantic. He did not appear to be searching for someone specific. He walked with an eerie composure that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. It was as though the panic belonged to everyone else. Not to him. When he encountered Kate Shepard, there was no confrontation. No exchange. No warning. He raised the shotgun and fired. The attack lasted only an instant. Kate collapsed with catastrophic injuries. Emergency medical teams would later rush her to hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save her life. Despite those efforts, she succumbed to her injuries. She became the 5th and final victim of the Plymouth shootings. By then, only a matter of minutes had passed since the first shot had been fired inside the Davison home. 5 innocent people were dead. 2 others had suffered serious injuries. An entire neighborhood had descended into fear. Yet the attack had not quite reached its conclusion. Jake Davison continued walking. That decision puzzled investigators from the very beginning. He did not immediately attempt to escape. He did not take hostages. He did not hide inside a building. Instead, he continued moving through the streets with the shotgun still in his possession. Several witnesses later recalled seeing him after the final shooting. One account in particular became widely discussed during the investigation. A passerby later told investigators that Jake appeared unexpectedly calm and, at one point, said words to the effect of, "There's nothing to worry about, mate." The remark was profoundly unsettling. Only moments earlier, he had left devastation across the neighborhood. Yet his demeanor suggested a complete detachment from the terror surrounding him. Whether the statement reflected emotional numbness, distorted thinking, or an inability to grasp the enormity of what he had done remains impossible to know with certainty. What investigators could establish was his behavior. He continued walking. He carried the weapon openly. He showed no sign of surrendering. Meanwhile, armed police officers were closing in. The emergency response had developed with extraordinary speed. Control room staff coordinated incoming reports. Witnesses helped identify the suspect's movements. Armed response vehicles raced through Plymouth toward Keyham, knowing that every passing second carried the possibility of another innocent life being lost. Unlike routine policing, incidents involving active firearms require immediate intervention. Officers understood that their priority was clear. Locate the gunman. Prevent further loss of life. As the distance between Jake and the approaching officers rapidly narrowed, the attack entered its final chapter. Investigators later determined that Jake realized armed police were approaching. Whether he saw them directly or understood that escape had become impossible could never be fully established. What happened next unfolded within moments. Before officers could reach him, Jake Davison turned the shotgun on himself. He fired. The wound proved instantly fatal. When armed police reached his position, the threat had already ended. The shooting was over. Approximately 6 minutes had passed since the first fatal shot inside the family home. 6 minutes. A length of time shorter than an average song. Shorter than boiling water for tea. Shorter than many daily telephone conversations. Yet within those 6 minutes, 5 innocent people had lost their lives, 2 others had been gravely injured, and an entire community had been changed forever. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. For residents hiding inside their homes, there was no immediate certainty that the danger had passed. Many remained behind locked doors until police officers went house to house, reassuring frightened families that it was safe to come outside. When people finally emerged, they stepped into a neighborhood they barely recognized. Blue flashing lights reflected across rows of brick houses. Police tape stretched between lamp posts. Armed officers secured every possible route. Paramedics moved urgently between casualties. Helicopters circled overhead. Neighbors who had spent years exchanging cheerful greetings now stood speechless, struggling to comprehend the devastation surrounding them. Some searched desperately for family members. Others embraced loved ones without speaking. Many simply stared. Trauma often begins with disbelief. The human mind instinctively resists accepting events that feel impossible. Residents repeatedly asked one another the same question. Did this really happen here? The answer was painfully obvious. The evidence surrounded them. Broken glass. Abandoned belongings. Emergency vehicles filling streets that had been quiet only minutes before. What had once been familiar roads were now active crime scenes. As darkness settled over Plymouth, forensic specialists prepared to begin the painstaking work that follows every major homicide investigation. Photographs would be taken. Evidence markers placed. Ballistic trajectories examined. Witnesses identified. Every second of the attack would eventually be reconstructed with meticulous precision. But before any laboratory analysis, before any official report, before any public inquiry, there remained something far more immediate. Families were waiting for news they never imagined they would receive. Parents. Children. Brothers. Sisters. Friends. Some would learn that a loved one had been seriously injured. Others would receive the devastating confirmation that someone they expected home for dinner would never walk through the front door again. For investigators, the case had only just begun. For the families, a lifetime of grief had already started. The 6 minutes of violence were over. The search for answers was only beginning. In the days ahead, detectives would uncover a trail of digital evidence, witness testimony, police records, and institutional decisions that would force Britain to confront difficult questions about mental health, online radicalization, firearm licensing, and opportunities that might have prevented one of the darkest acts of mass violence in modern British history. The gunfire had fallen silent. The investigation was about to speak.